I'm Sue Bastian, and I've just been around a long, long time. And I have to tell you that I have loved every minute of it. It has been, for me, a life blessing to belong to the theory of knowledge, to belong to the IB, to love it. And I hope you already do, and if not, a little bit better or a little clearer after our session. While you're settling in, the name of this session is How Do I Know Thee? Let Me Count the Ways of Knowing. And I was asked to do something on the theme of the conference, and that's what I'm going to do. First, while we're getting settled, and I'm looking for someone to come in, my own ways of knowing could stand some improvement. I came down to Washington about, I don't know what, was it 8 months ago, and I came a few days early before the workshop, and the government shut down. And I didn't have very good powers of judgment then, so this time I thought I'm coming on down, and I'll take the train instead of the airplane, because thunderstorms and delays and whatnot. And so I found myself yesterday on a train that had to evacuate us to another train across little, like pull up and match the door openings and put some kind of thing across and then take your bags with you and don't make it wobble too much. And I thought, well, okay, here I am, and I just wonder, to kick off this ways of knowing, if you would think for a minute about all the ways of knowing that you use to get to Washington, or that you use to get around this hotel for that matter. So the ways of knowing, if you take a look at your handout on page 2, there's no cover page. I don't know why. I'm so grateful they Xeroxed them without the machine breaking and without anybody frowning that I don't care. But take a look at the ways of knowing on page 2 of this handout. Areas of knowledge is what we know, and ways of knowing is how we know it. So just everybody should hear their voice in the room before we begin. So turn to someone and tell real quick the ways of knowing you used to get here. Nobody's going to ask you to recite or speak up, but I just want you to get the ball going here. You know, it's not an easy thing to do. I've been in tight spots before, but Friday afternoon at a conference with out-of-towners in a cosmopolitan city, I'm telling you. So speak up a minute, get loose, and then we'll get started.
Do you remember how many you had printed?
115.
Right, we're on 98 at the moment. So we'll hang on to these as people come in, I'll hand them out.
Okay. All of them?
Well, I think we need to define faith.
All right, everybody. All right. Let's pick it up now. There'll always be those who say, well, it depends on what you mean by faith. It depends on what you mean by, or I know that some of you think that there's a kind of hierarchy, and they seem more prevalent in your life or more important in your knowing anything. And that'll be part of what we're going to talk about today. I certainly find a hierarchy in my life, and could anybody guess what that is? Perception? Well, no, it's not. Yeah, I think I'm lost. Language? You know, I bet I couldn't get along without that. It's just that it's so obvious that I don't think about it. But I think that I put reason right up there at the top. And every time I get into, emotion or something, I always validate it with the reasons. And so that's just part of what it is for me to be a self-aware of my own way of going through the world. But part of the reason we have ways of knowing at all has to do with self-awareness for students. In the old days, we had areas of knowledge, and you could learn what is science well, and what is history, and what is ethics. And the knower kind of fell out of the whole thing. And we wanted the knower to be at the center. After all, in the beginning, it was the student is meant to pause and reflect. And so we added ways of knowing as a kind of methodology, a kind of going through life to become a knower and be aware of it, and be aware of your own knower profile. So I think I'm prejudiced in favor of reason, but I don't know how other people would see that or how you would see yourself. But for instance, the CAS students, I always ask the CAS students, what ways of knowing are you going to use as you go into your service project? And it wasn't always easy for them to articulate that, but it was good when they did. It was good for being a theory of knowledge student, and it was good for being a CAS service worker. It was good to have that kind of examined life. But I'm going to suggest that there's another way of knowing, and my list would be longer. I think doubt and curiosity are ways of knowing, and maybe they can be picked up and put in the others. I don't know. But I'm going to suggest, for our purposes today, that history is a way of knowing. And I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you the history of the theory of knowledge so that you can kind of get a sense of why it is where it is in the IB program. Long ago, 50 years ago almost, in the raging 60s, and it's not surprising it was in the 60s, that a bunch of revolutionaries and visionaries sat around a table and talked about a better way for students to learn. And with a better way of learning would come a better world. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that you have the pragmatic value here of better education, the best education indeed for a mobile student population, people who were moving around the world and they needed to be prepared as they went from here to there and there to here. And then, on the other hand, the best education for a better world. It was a hugely idealistic goal that people were not ashamed of. And that was a legacy from the League of Nations, a better world when students learn how to have a creative, critical, sympathetic exercise of mind. And so they started in. And I want you to imagine, I want you to think that you're around that table and everything is burning up in America anyway, in the US, I mean. And it's civil rights, and it's Vietnam, and things are happening over in the streets of Paris. Just things are going on, and education is not have the whole dramatic element that some of these other protests had. But mark my word, it was revolutionary. They were turning their backs on their national systems. Alec Peterson from the UK, well, that was specializing too early. And over in Germany, it was too encyclopedic. And in France, it was too like lockstep and so forth. And over in America, they didn't have anything at all. So it was an amazing time of turmoil. And they said, what should we do? We have tabula rasa. Well, you know what? You don't. This is the world we live in, and you need to have an instruction in language. And then you know what? If it's going to be international, it has to have a second language. 1 and 2 are easy. And then it's the scientific age, so you have to have science. And then math, the queen of the sciences, you have to have that. So we're up to 4. And then what do you need? Well, they used to call it the study of man until the women got mad. And then it's now called individuals in society. And then you had to have, some art or something like that. But if you didn't like all of that stuff, you could do some more science. So that's it. And everybody's so happy. They're sitting around, they have a curriculum, and then the French said, wait a minute. If you're with their lovely French syllogisms, wait a minute. If you are educated, then you've taken philosophy. If you haven't taken philosophy, you're not educated. Just imagine. And the Brit said, what's that all about? What is going on here? Philosophy bakes no bread. It's a huge waste of time. We're walking away. There's a big impasse. They've already agreed the need for research and the need for the cast, but that was the deal breaker. And then there came an idea floating around from actually Canada and the US, from actually Oxford, about something called forms of knowledge, that they each had their own object of study, their own vocabulary, their own proofs, their own all of that. And students could learn them, and they had a match with the then hexagon. And so that was a compromise. And what was last became first with our wonderful theory of knowledge, which is the pride of the program, and it makes it a program. And I want to say just one more word, what a program is. A program, unlike, I'll use the US here, the AP, or the A and O levels in England, a program is central and unifying, and everybody has to take it. Harpo Hansen, who was head of the AP at the time, said, "Oh, you know, I'm old enough to have known him. You know what?" He said, "I wish I had gotten myself a program, a theory of knowledge, instead of having just a collection of subjects." The collection of subjects, he said, AP was always meant as a school reform movement. If you get the classes to improve at the top, and then all the boats would rise and so forth. And he said it actually didn't work that way. It just hived off all the good kids and became elitist. Well, that's true and not true, but that's the way he saw it. So, but a program is meant to have an effect such that something shines right through, that you can tell an IB student. It's just as sure as you can probably tell I was trained by the Jesuits. It's there. And really and truly, there are IB students where the experience that they've had makes them identifiable to one another. And it gives them habits of mind, and it gives them values, if everything has worked right, to be the splendid instance that we want for our young people. Some of it is captured in the learner profile, but not all of it. So the IB and the theory of knowledge is the answer to a question: what do we want our students to know and be able to do? And the difference is that it's about the students. What do we want our students? It's student-centered in that way. It's not subject-centered. The way almost all the top academic programs in the world of most nations are academic-centered. Not all of them, but that stands in contrast to many of the ways that people think about the baccalaureate. The baccalaureate is an international one, and it's a learning how to learn, and it's what used to be called, until it passed away, like all those phrases that become tired, learning how to learn and the whole person. In that sense, the IB is a movement, and if you're part of the IB, you should know that. It's partly what used to be called character education. It's looking at the student. And if you drew that student today, you wouldn't draw just a big head with all of the academic subjects. You would draw, if you don't mind the oversimplification, the head, the heart, the hands, and some kind of healing. That's a little corny, but I'm from Kansas, and I belong to the 4-H, and so I couldn't resist. Any questions? Okay. Oh. All right. Don't look. I want to say two things. One is that these areas of knowledge are meant to be the dominant list in the curriculum. That the ways of knowing, in a way, are handmaidens to the areas of knowledge. They're not meant to stand on their own. They're meant to be transitive in that sense. So we're talking about the ways of knowing today, but if you were a teacher, you would try to embed those ways of knowing as you taught the area of knowledge called history, or science, or math. And of course, you're a teacher with your own ways, so you would have to step back and say, well, what we're talking about when we talk about faith, what we're talking about, I think, when we talk about perception, let's just take a minute here and see what that's all about. But it would be in service of understanding the disciplines better. Is that kind of clear? Okay. However, I'm going to show you what I mean by their being embedded. And I think you could see, couldn't you, in getting to Washington, how many of those ways of knowing, you could hardly tell where one left off and the other one started, if at all. But I'm going to tell you a little story that some of you have heard, and that's okay because it's not about the story called the Semmelweis childbirth fever discovery. It's about the ways that of knowing are just threaded throughout that real life situation. That's a big theory of knowledge word now, real life situation. Now, long ago in 1850, people, women, families, sent their mothers about to deliver to a hospital in Vienna, a lying-in hospital. It was new at the time. And that's the setting. Then there comes a man, and I want you now to be listening. If you had a little checklist, you could say, oh, we're talking here about the history of the subject, science. We're talking about science, the human pace of science. Oh, it sounds like she's giving us a little bit of that history of the science. Okay, that's right. And here comes that little man, and he is a new doctor and very ambitious and excited about his life, but he's Jewish, and the hospital is a Protestant organization, and he's junior, and the grand doctors are very much ruling the organization, and so he's an outsider, and you have to use your imagination here because I saw it on stage. So if you can imagine the proscenium, and you can imagine that it's the triage room of the hospital, and the doctors enter in their gowns, and Semmelweis is at the side, and he's looking up, they're making their rounds, and they do not see what he sees. At the left, he sees something called Ward A, where he knows, and they all know if they care to recognize it, that the mortality rate for women of childbed fever is about 14%, ranging from 14 to 19%. Ward B, the mortality rate is about 5%. Now I ask you, can you imagine those women with their great bodies there moaning and groaning, and the only person who sees that situation, that there's a discrepancy, is Semmelweis. And he can't bear it. Is he curious or is he alarmed? Very hard to tell in the beginning, but he does take action, and he begins to inquire, and the people who are senior to him find him to be quite a pest, and they don't want to be bothered with. It's almost a whistleblower kind of thing. But they're allowed. After all, they want to make money, you see. They want people to keep coming, and you know what will happen if that little thing isn't fixed. So what happened next was that Semmelweis began to do thought experiments. And it's good for students to see that you don't just do every experiment like in a lab. You run things through your head. Well, what could it be? What could it be? Imagine what it could be. If it's the water, then it should affect everybody. It's not affecting everybody equally, therefore it's not the water. Well, if it's the food, well, if it's the this, well, if it's the that, well, it's not that. It's a time-honored technique that people use. And then he happens upon an amazing phenomenon. His friend dies with the same symptoms as the childbed fever women. His friend is a man. And he is just ashamed that he's been misled by the language of the naming of the ailment, that it distracted him from the way that he needed to go in his inquiry. So the long and the short is that he did, in fact, discover what could be a cure. We're using these in layman's terms. What could be a cure? He found out that if you wash your hands, well, they were washing their hands, the doctors who took care of Ward A, they were washing their hands. But if they washed their hands in chlorinated lime, then these things, what things? These things, listen to the language, these 1 million invisible things on your hands would stop killing people. Now, just think about it. If somebody came to you today and said, you know what? You have invisible things crawling all over you. And all you have to do is take a shower in chlorinated lime and everything will be better. Just be honest with yourself and imagine your response. So to keep on with this is of no use for us here, although it is for the students. But the doctors were furious. There are things I'm working on here as a teacher with ways of knowing, but I'm also trying to show that knowledge is a triumph, that knowledge is not always embraced, that the obstacles that prevent what we like to call progress are present and very often very firmly in place by the sociology of the time. The passion required for Semmelweis to get to where he got, such that the two wards could be equal in terms of their mortality rate, is something that touches me today. I don't know how many of us would have been victims of something like that. I wish that it weren't so today. I read the other day in the New York Times a week ago that there's a pattern of error in the U.S. Veterans hospitals, such that the babies who comparatively speaking, actually do have a hemorrhage rate and the mothers and mortality that is not scrutinized. And you think, even though we have knowledge, it takes something else. It takes a form of caring to put in place the things that you know how to do. How many ways of knowing did you hear in that story? Yeah? Anybody? Shout it out. Oh, you know one thing which is really important? He thought maybe the priest going through giving the last rites was scaring people. So the idea of you only test what's plausible. You don't test things you can't think up. It's like that one good thing for me, that Donald Rumsfeld ever said, and that was, there are unknown unknowns. And these you can't work with. It may be there, and we are short-sighted in some intellectual way. So, any questions? Can you see how the ways of knowing can be part of any discipline? I don't have to go into it. You can imagine now. You all have imagination. Did you hear imagination? Oh, here's something. Here's something. Do you know who, to make matters worse, do you know who was taking care of the ward that had the high mortality rate? The doctors. That made it worse. Just that word, that title, prevented people from seeing that kind of category as being involved in some way. Now, midwives were taking care of the other group. Now I want to talk about the two ways of knowing that seem most dominant to me are reason and perception. It may be that it's not true. It may be that I think that because I see it everywhere, and I name it, and we talk about it. Just like with the senses, sense perception, most people don't talk about their sense of smell very much as helping them make their way in the world. The kids talk about the vision. Oh, my vision, that's the privileged sense. But I thought, I don't know. Maybe if we knew more about how our sense of smell kind of gets us going or chooses our mate for us or something, maybe we'd have a different view about our noses. Who knows? There's just, I figure, a lot that falls on the outside of into the shadows. But when you're talking about perception, we mean sense perception. You're talking about knowing something with your reason. You're talking about the rationality of things. And another story that I have to tell, it's not long. That one was long. There are no more long stories. And if I got up in front and I said, reason today versus empirical, sense perception, observation, versus logic and so forth. It wouldn't grab anyone. And all of my lessons had to be what I call engaging and memorable, otherwise it didn't work with my students. They were city kids and they already knew everything they thought. So, if you start out with a man and a woman upstairs in bed, everybody stops texting for a moment. And pretty soon you'll be able to write this script. The woman says to the man, honey, I hear somebody downstairs. I think it's a burglar. Go and see. He says, it can't be a burglar. The alarm would have gone off. The alarm didn't go off, so it couldn't have been a burglar. He's Mr. Rationality, and she's Miss Observation. She's from the Show Me State in Missouri, and she needs seeing is believing. She's empirical. And sure enough, he says, can't be. She said, yes, but. Can't be, yes, but. Well, the dog would have barked, he says, if somebody had come in the house. Yes, she says, but he could have chloroformed the dog. Yes, but. I'll go down, he says. All right, he's just a proxy for her. Down he goes around, he looks around, he comes back up there. I told you it couldn't be, there's nobody. She says, did you look everywhere? Yes, I looked everywhere. Did you look in the kitchen? I looked in the kitchen. Well, when you were in the kitchen, he could have gone downstairs. Well, so it will never end. because you're making the point of having two different ways of knowing, two different ways of methodology, two different verification principles, two different ways you test your ideas. And students have dispositions within themselves. Nobody is exactly like Spock or something like, but, and nobody is like, you know, some kind of ridiculous woman who's always whatever, the way they used to think in the 17th century. But it points up a kind of pride of place, I think, of these two, at least in our schools and in our, what used to be the hexagon, the sphere now, that these two ways of knowing are stronger than most of the others. For shared knowledge. For shared knowledge. Maybe not for personal knowledge, maybe not for private knowledge. But we ask students to be able to speak and show and demonstrate with these two ways of knowing. If you take a look over in your handout, on page 3, there is something where you have ways of knowing. And I use this diagram because I'm trying to make the point throughout the whole ways of knowing that they give a kind of dynamic to the construction of knowledge. They're very fond nowadays of saying the production of knowledge, the construction of it, the generation of knowledge. How do we generate knowledge? They're not so much talking about how we discover it, but how we actually make it. And way over on the left, you can have all those hunches. You can have feelings. You can have, I don't know what else is there, hearsay. People tell you things. The TV tells you things, you read things, your parents, maybe even your teachers tell you things. But there's a conversion going on. If you want to get your knowledge into public knowledge, shared knowledge, areas of knowledge, you have to go through certain steps. And some of those steps are the same for almost everything, and then some of them are more definitive of one area of knowledge than the other. One correction that's good about this sort of way of thinking is that knowledge is the answer to a question someone once asked. It's not just a bunch of books with inert facts in it. Sometimes it can seem like that to a high school student. But there is something going on constantly. And knowledge in the making for Semmelweis is really important because there's no germ theory then. There's no paradigm of pathogens. And if there were, then nobody would have stopped to worry about it. They would have talked about the bacteria present and they would have gotten going with the antidotes and so forth. But when you have no theory to explain things, then it's kind of all up for grabs. Today we have the theories of this and that we didn't have before, and it's important. Theory is a most misunderstood word for theory of knowledge students, for TOK students. Theory, even for theory of knowledge, means something like from the Greek word for theater, that it's the way you look at something. If you can see it that way, the Greek term meant sitting from within and looking at something. And a theory helps you look at it and understand it. And that's what theory means in theory of knowledge. And the same thing with the explanatory power of theories is just amazing. It's a story. and it predicts. And those are the two features that students need to learn over and over again, well beyond somebody saying, well, it's only a theory. A theory for me, well, I love the quote, a theory is a fantasy constrained by fact. Do you know who said that? I did. But these theories of ours are just amazing. The theories of creation, the theories of evolution, the theories of plate tectonics. Who can think up such things? But they're grounded in what we call a fact, lots of facts, and those facts need explaining. And so the theory is the logical part, and the persuasive part, and the facts are the building blocks. The thing about reasoning, just one more little thing, is that kids make generalizations. We all do. If you couldn't generalize from your experience, then you truly, there are people housed in mental hospitals who cannot generalize. Their powers of confidence are so weakened, and truly it is a form of insanity. It is a mark of rationality that we can generalize from our experience. But you have to be able to have criteria for the worth of it and the strength of it. But in the perception, I want to just say, we have the snapshot model of perception that you open your eyes and presto, you see a whole big picture with details and color and resolution, sort of from the center out to the periphery, and that's a model that is very reassuring. But it has a human element to it that isn't shared by I don't know how many other creatures in the world. So we have to understand the limitations of our perception. And that kind of teaching is way beyond, just the fun of optical illusions and so forth. But at the same time, there's an almost irresistible notion that something really happened, that you are looking at something. And even at the level of, in Wimbledon, the ball did go in or out, that things happen in the world and we can know them. And there is so much good stuff going on with perception that it's everybody's favorite. It's most people's favorite over logic. I like logic myself, but I want to ask you about, do you think you are perceivers more than, or is that just a silly question? But what do you actually look at, and how do you look at it? That's what I wondered. I asked, would you actually look in Galileo's telescope years ago? Would you be that curious? Or would you be, well, maybe I think about things like that. If I were walking by and somebody said, hey, get over here and have a look at this thing. We're looking at the moon. You never saw this in your life. What would stop you from doing that? Anybody?
At the time, they were fearful of sinning.
A fear.
Yes, they were afraid of sinning because they were not sure of God's creation's viewpoint. So they were, at that time, whatever they would believe would be a risk of life.
Well, you have to be a kind of a risk taker, don't you?
You would be a partner in that sin.
That's right. I like to think I would run right over there and look and be amazed, and yet, you know what? I'm not sure. Because it's too much. It's not a little thing. To look, to see, there's a cost to that. And there's also theories in place that say it ain't so. There are, like Nietzsche said, that we in TOK are fond of saying, there's no immaculate perception. You already have in your mind the way things are. And to be asked to see it upside down is too much. Knowledge, again, is a triumph. How many times in your life has your fate depended on mistaken perception? Yeah? Somebody speak up. Tell us a story. Let me stop talking a minute. Come on, you're teachers.
I was actually just having a conversation with my wife and thinking of how anybody who's married knows this, how your spouse says something, you have to read into the tone of voice and how they say it. Fine never means fine. So that's the first thing I thought of was we were debating plans, and she said, we could do this or we could do that. And I went, that's a minefield. I'm going to go back to what she I know, she said it, but I knew exactly what she meant was by
Yeah. Well, but you sound very sensitive. You sound like you're a wonderful husband.
I learned the rule that I can be happy or right. You can't have it.
Yeah.
Just to keep on with the marriage kind of stories because they're good. We bought our house 10 years ago, and just 2 weeks ago, my husband was telling his friends from high school, because he ran into a couple of friends from high school, he told them, well, I actually like the house now, but when we bought it, I just wanted to make my life and my wife happier.
Oh, I did that. My wife did that.
Right? So there you go. So,
Well, you're bordering on you're bordering on the power and the persuasiveness of language as well. Another way of our knowing, and yes.
Well, just a more basic, especially if you want to talk about your fate hinging on it. I was driving up here yesterday and some moron, out of, no, it wasn't even here. It was way down close to home, just pulled out in front of me, out of nowhere. It was completely ridiculous. I was much too close and going much too fast. And absolutely my perception, my ability to perceive that rapidly and understand what it meant. So that I could
Well,
slam on
what
brakes
is
and slow.
interesting is that if it got to court, that you would have a difficulty, says Elizabeth Loftus, in the eyewitness accounts, that they're notoriously unreliable. And I go back, the echo of it appears that something really happened, and that you can know it. And that's enormously important for someone in theory of knowledge. In what way do we have limitations on our perception and on the meaning of the language we use? Once the words are out, Emily Dickinson says, they don't die that day, they just begin to live that day. Talking about language as a way of knowing, I had a friend the other day who said, I separated from my husband. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. She said, I said, can I ask why? And she said, I couldn't stand the way he used language. And I didn't know what she meant. Was it like he used me instead of I, or what? She said, accuracy for him is not a virtue. Accuracy for him is not a virtue. And she said, I believe that precision is important. I'm like that Confucius, she said, that you're always talking about. I'm not always talking about Confucius, but he says that language should not be arbitrary, that in the rectification of names, Analects way back when, he said, above all, things must have the right names, or art and morals disappear, and doubt comes in where trust should be. So I thought to myself, what limitations do you put on your language? Do you even know? That's where we would use language in ethics. If you talk about weaving them in, the concept of lying is an interesting one in ethics, to combine ethics and language, because I did ask the students, I won't ask you, can you go one day without lying? They were stunned. Like Monica Lewinsky, she said, that's the way you get by in life. You lie all the time. So that leads to it. The point is not to preach and wag your finger. The point is to say what is going on when you name the world and then deny it. We had such a good time with that language and ethics thing and lying, whatever you mean by lying, that for once, this never happened. My students followed me into the department and they said, oh, what about this? What about that? I said, oh, that's fascinating. Cicely Bach says this and so on and so forth. And St. Augustine said that. And she said, then the phone rang and my friend said, Sue, it's for you. And I said, tell them I'm not here. They never even noticed. I'm not saying that's a big deal. I'm saying that. You know what I'm saying. All right. I want to just say that emotion is very often, it created a lot of emotion itself to even put it in theory of knowledge. But you know about the id and Plato's black and white horses warring and so forth. And we know that emotion can have the most certainty for you, the conviction. And it's important that we see that most of us, the emotion can be convincing, but it's not for anybody else. Our own private emotion. The first time I taught theory of knowledge, one kid, I thought he was quite brave, put his hand up and he said, why don't my feelings count as knowledge? That was a concern for a 17-year-old. I think what I would like to tell you is what we actually talk about in class is that there are people now who are thinking that emotions are way more than tears and Sturmendrang, that they are judgments of value. They are judgments of survival. That your body senses fear before you recognize it. That there are gut feelings now, even in ethics, real troubling there, where you have an immediate response to goodness or its opposition, and then feel tongue-tied until you can explain yourself, because we require one another to give reasons for what you do. But at the most serious level of scholarship now is the business of it's all hooked up to this thing going on with the neuroscience and the brain imaging. And one of the most interesting ones is a game. I don't have to give you the details. You have to take my word for it, though, and I'm not lying, is that two people are playing the game and the stakes are high, and they almost always do the wrong thing tactically. And in order to win, you have to do the reverse of what most people start out doing. But what is interesting in for what we're talking about is that they're wired up in some way. And the body begins to sweat and recognize and make changes long before the conscious mind gets it. And this is a man named Antonio Damasio. Many of you may have heard of him. He's a neuroscience out in California, Portuguese fellow, very, very senior in the field. And so I think that the heart has its reasons that the mind will never know. It's worth thinking about for students, what it might mean. Again, you're not trying to deliver a message that should be accepted, but bringing forth something provocative that the student can grapple with. Now here I'm going to ask you to speak again. Intuition is, you can follow on your list, we're moving along. Intuition was very often considered to be an emotion. We talked about intuition, we worked it in when we talked about emotion as a way of knowing, but it's really hard, Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, he's talking about the first 2 seconds. He's not talking about considered cost analysis, if this, then that. He's talking about a voice. He's talking about something that is so instantaneous, we give it the name intuition. And it's way more the firefighters, the generals in battle, the air traffic controllers. It's not just women in the third eye or something. They're talking about how they don't have any time to make decisions. They know immediately what they have to do. It can also be kind of a shared intuition where the unwritten rules of behavior are so apparent within the situation as a response that they almost move as one. But here's the interesting one for us. Harvard Graduate School of Education claims, I'm shortcutting some of this stuff, but claims that you don't have to have 3 observations to tell if a teacher is a good teacher. You need something like 4 or 5 seconds. Isn't that something? Yes. When I was observed, I'd think, oh my gosh, she won't get it because she wasn't there yesterday. And she's going to leave before class is over when I do my big wind-up. And yes? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Can that be true? 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 10 seconds even? And you can tell? You're shaking your head. Are you a principal or a teacher? Is that okay for your evaluation?
Sometimes, and they know whether or not you have that, what we call withedness, where you can engage the student.
I have a son-in-law who is a doctor, and he said he can tell in 4 or 5 seconds if he wants a guy on his team or not. Now, he can't set up the criteria. So he's not allowed to choose that way. We're talking about a private conviction. A union wouldn't allow that. But how far does that go? Teachers choosing a stockbroker, a A doctor? Speed dating? Well, I don't know very many people who had the love at first sight intuition thing going on when they met. I didn't. I think it would have been wonderful, but it doesn't happen that way. It doesn't mean that intuition is infallible either. I'm just saying that it is identified as a way of knowing in theory of knowledge now, independent of it being slipped in as an emotional thing. Okay. See, really, snap judgments are what you're not supposed to have, in a way. It depends on who you're around, but jumping to conclusions, snap judgments, whatever. But privately, I find my intuitions almost irresistible. I'm very serious about that. It is a theory of knowledge question. When should you deny the message of your intuition? Under what conditions? It's one of the essay topics. Yeah.
Hi, excuse me. I'd like to share something that might be fitting to what you're saying about intuition. There is a British biologist by the name Robert Sheldrake, and he talked about the morphogenetic field. So people do believe that we have immediate access to this morphogenetic field where information is retrieved. So this is probably the navel that we have connection to this body of information. So this sustains your intuition, in short.
Yes. Yes. Very good. Very good. Moving along now, I want to talk about I kind of skip over. Imagination is not contested as a way of knowing. It was brought to our attention by the students who wanted to know why it didn't count. But I'd like to tell you something about memory as a way of knowing, and then we'll end up with faith, and then we'll call it a day. But students do need to be reminded of the imagination that can take place in science or in history. They do have images of the scientist and the history, and they're almost always men, and they're almost always funny-looking scholars, and they almost never include the imagination, the imaginative, the creative part of it. So I wouldn't pass it over with. But memory, it's a poor sort of memory that only works backward. Remember that line from Lewis Carroll? Isn't that darling? I don't even know what it means, but Tennessee Williams says everything is memory. And we go back there to, never mind, it's obvious that you can deal with memory and history and documented memory and perception there and so forth. But there's an idea that people have memories, like in a store, like in a file, and that the problem is retrieval. And the people today are asking us to have another think about that it's more a reconstruction each time you remember something, that the possession model of having memories and kind of now with the MRIs, they find memory centers and so forth. But if you think about your first memory, just take 10 seconds, not more than that. First memory. I remember sitting on the floor with my grandfather, and he's kind of building the fire and I'm watching. But you know what? I'm not seeing out the eyes of the 3-year-old. I'm seeing the child I am sitting with the grandfather. A real memory would be seeing out of the eyes of the 3-year-old the things there. I remember sitting with my grandmother for 4 hours one morning in her hospital room. I don't have 4 hours of memory. It isn't that way that you can whoop, hit the button, and the video replay starts the same 4 hours. Just asking us to rethink, because memory has a quality to it. You won't believe this, that in Holland they actually admitted evidence, memory evidence, and they set it up so that the suspect, it was a woman murderer, and she had, they claimed, killed somebody, and they had a recreation of the room and had her wired up in the way that they do. I don't know how they do that, little pinholes in your skull or something. And then they said that the little centers lit up when the right stimulation was offered, and only that person could have known or remembered it. That was admitted into court as evidence. It hasn't happened in this side of the ocean. I actually looked it up because I thought, I don't believe that story. But it's part of the archives of the court of The Hague. Isn't that astonishing? You would have some kind of, well, and it's like perception, you know, do you actually remember things that fit together and make sense, or do you actually remember things that totally happened, in fact? A kind of coherence model or a correspondence one. Just something to think about in the ways of knowing. Now we end up with our faith. I've not given it very much time, just on purpose, because it really has been contentious that there would be faith as a way of knowing. Why not? This is a big organization now, countries all over the world. And so I want to tell you very quickly about my daughter-in-law and my son. Now, they're both intellectuals, and she's like just so smart, it's scary. And so I was saying, well, we have faith as a way of knowing now. And she said, and my son said, what? I said, yeah, the new program, we have faith as a way of knowing. And Erica, this kind of brilliant tax lawyer, said, of course, faith is a way of knowing. And my son looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. And he said, what are you talking about? He said, you're an atheist. She said, well, I know, but I'm talking about faith, like trust or confidence, like axioms in mathematics and so forth. He said, but you can't prove. It's the same thing. She said, you don't prove it, but you believe in it. And they had the most interesting conversation. You'd think they'd taken theory of knowledge. But it does tend to get back to religious knowledge if you can't steer it just right. There's something in Hebrew, I wrote it because it was so lovely. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. There's a sense in which, and I tell you this story, I asked once for a sign. I was very religious, and I asked for a sign, and I was doubting, and my faith was in jeopardy, and I went to the prairie, I'm from Kansas, and I didn't get my sign. I didn't get lightning. I didn't get burning bushes. And my sister said, if you need evidence, you don't have faith. It made me think. And she said, maybe faith is what you need the way Kierkegaard said, it's a leap to faith. Maybe the evidence, however, was all around you and you couldn't see it. And maybe believing is seeing, not seeing is believing. Does any of that make sense to you? Well, it is our newest way of knowing, and it has been it has been just very lively. Let's put it that way. In logic, you say, it's always in the textbook of the logic. Oh, God, how do you know God exists? I know God exists, or the prophet, or whatever, because the Bible or the Quran says so. And I can believe the Bible because it's the Word of God. So you say, you take A to prove B, and B to prove A. That's a fallacy in logic. In the world of faith, it makes perfect sense. Well, we have reached the end of our ways of knowing, so I thank you very much.